There's a moment in life when everything you have built, everything you love, everything you have sacrificed for, can vanish in less than 60 seconds. Not because of a storm, not because of bad luck, but because someone you trusted, someone who sat at your table, someone who smiled at your face, decided that your life was worth less than what they could take from you. This is not a story about wealth. This is not a story about power. This is a story about a 10-year-old boy who saw what grown men missed, who heard what careful adults whispered in the dark, and who made one quiet decision that changed the course of everything. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you loved, if you have ever been saved by someone you underestimated, then stay right here, because what you are about to hear will stay with you long after this video ends. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Callaway was 52 years old on the morning his life nearly ended. He woke up at 6:15, same as always. He made his coffee, dark roast, no sugar, 2 cups, and stood at the kitchen window of his 11-room estate in Charlotte, North Carolina, watching the early morning fog sit low over the backyard garden. His wife, Diane, was already downstairs, dressed and quiet. His teenage son, Tyler, was still asleep upstairs. His daughter, Cassidy, was away at college in Raleigh. Everything felt ordinary. Everything felt safe. That is the cruelest part of a story like this, that the morning something terrible is about to happen, the sky still looks exactly the same. The birds still sing. The coffee still smells right. And a man who built his life with his own 2 hands has absolutely no idea that by 9 o'clock, the people closest to him will have already decided his fate. Richard had not always lived in that house. He had not always driven a luxury car, or employed a household staff, or signed contract worth 7 figures. 26 years earlier, he was a 26-year-old man with a beat-up Chevy pickup truck, a commercial driver's license, and a stubbornness that his mother used to call both his greatest gift and his worst flaw. He started Callaway Freight Solutions out of a storage unit in Greensboro with 2 trucks and 1 employee, himself. He drove overnight routes, handled the books by hand, and ate gas station sandwiches for 3 years straight because he could not afford anything else. He missed birthdays. He missed Christmases. He drove through ice storms and hailstorms, and one particularly brutal December night when the roads outside Asheville were so bad he had to pull over and sleep in the cab of his truck for 4 hours just to stay alive. But he kept going. He always kept going. That was the thing about Richard Callaway. He was not the smartest man in any room, and he knew it. But he was the one who stayed. By the time he was 35, Callaway Freight had 12 trucks and a regional contract with a major hardware chain. By 40, he had gone national. By 45, he had over 300 employees, a private office in uptown Charlotte, and a net worth that financial magazines had estimated, conservatively, at just over $1.2 billion. He gave generously to local schools. He sponsored youth baseball leagues. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of the janitors in his building and asked about their families because he had once been the man nobody remembered. People respected him, and more importantly, people liked him. That distinction mattered to Richard more than he ever admitted out loud. He had grown up in a small house in a working-class neighborhood where respect and warmth were 2 different currencies, and he had worked hard to earn both. So when the people he trusted began to move against him, the damage was not just financial. It was the kind of wound that goes deeper than money ever can. The morning of September the 14th started like every other Tuesday. Richard had a 9 o'clock meeting with his senior executive team at the headquarters downtown. His driver, a man named Gerald Sutton, had worked for him for 4 years. Gerald was punctual, professional, and quiet in the way that Richard appreciated. Not cold, just steady. He drove a black Lincoln Navigator, always arrived at the front gate by 8:10, and had never once been late. Richard would come out at 8:15. They would exchange a few words about the weather or the previous weekend's football scores, and then the 20-minute ride to the office would pass in comfortable silence. It was one of those small daily rituals that Richard had come to rely on without ever thinking about it. That is exactly why it made such a perfect opportunity for someone who had been watching him closely. At 8:12 that morning, Richard was in his bedroom putting on his jacket when he heard a knock at his door. It was one of the housekeepers, a woman named Beverly Carter who had worked for the family for 7 years. She asked him if he needed anything before she started the morning clean. He thanked her and said no. What he did not know was that Beverly's son, a 10-year-old boy named Daniel, had arrived early that morning with his mother because his school was closed for a teacher work day. Daniel was a quiet child, serious in a way that most adults found almost unsettling in someone so young. He liked puzzles. He liked patterns. He noticed things. He had been sitting in the small staff break room near the east side of the house when something caught his attention through the narrow window that faced the front gate. He saw a black Lincoln Navigator pull up. He saw a man get out, straighten his jacket, and stand exactly where Gerald always stood. Same posture, same suit, same car. But Daniel had been watching Gerald arrive every time he came to the house with his mother. And something about what he was seeing made the small hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He could not immediately explain it. He just knew. He pressed his face closer to the glass and looked harder. Then he understood. Gerald Sutton always carried a silver travel mug with a blue lid, every single morning, without exception. The man at the gate had nothing in his hands. And Gerald's silver wedding ring, which was wide and distinctive and which Daniel had once asked about because it had a small compass engraved on it, was not on this man's finger. Daniel did not panic. He did not run. He moved carefully and quietly through the side hallway toward the front staircase, because that was how you moved when you were trying not to be seen. He found Richard at the top of the stairs, jacket on, briefcase in hand, ready to walk out the front door. And Daniel said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Don't move. Follow me." Richard looked down at him. He knew the boy. He had seen him around the house a handful of times over the years, but they had never spoken directly. "That man at the gate isn't Gerald," Daniel said. Richard's first instinct was the one most adults have in that moment. The gentle, dismissive impulse to explain to a child that they are probably mistaken. But something in the boy's eyes stopped him. There was no excitement there. No drama. Just certainty. Richard did not walk out the door. Instead, he took one slow step toward the narrow window beside the entrance and looked out. The man at the gate was standing perfectly still, hands at his sides, eyes forward. And then Richard saw it, the absence of the ring. Gerald had worn that ring every single day since Richard had known him. It was the kind of detail you do not notice until it is suddenly, jarringly gone. Richard's chest went cold. He pulled back from the window and looked at Daniel. "What else do you know?" he asked. And that is when Daniel told him. The night before, he had been sitting on the floor in the hallway outside the kitchen. His mother had asked him to wait there while she finished cleaning inside, and he had heard voices. Not loud voices. The kind of voices that people use when they absolutely do not want to be overheard. He had heard a man's voice he did not recognize say, "He leaves at 8:15. The driver knows the route. Everything is already paid for." And then he had heard another voice, one that he did recognize. He had heard it before, in this house, and it belonged to someone who had no business being in that kitchen after midnight. He described the voice to Richard. Richard went very still. Then he took out his phone and called his head of personal security. Not from the house line, from his personal cell, and told him quietly and calmly that he needed someone at the property immediately, that Gerald was possibly missing, and that the man at the front gate needed to be detained without warning the rest of the staff. He told Daniel to go back to the break room, lock the door from the inside, and not open it for anyone except his mother. Daniel nodded and did exactly that without asking a single question. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of controlled unraveling that security professionals are trained for and that ordinary people only see in films. Two members of Richard's private security team arrived through the rear service entrance. The man at the front gate, who had identified himself over the intercom as Gerald Sutton, was detained within minutes. He was not Gerald. His name, which investigators would confirm later that day, was a man who had a prior criminal record in 2 states and who had been hired through a third party specifically for this job. The real Gerald Sutton was found 2 hours later, locked inside the trunk of a rental car parked 4 blocks away from the property. He was unharmed, but badly shaken. He told investigators that 2 men had approached him the previous evening in the parking garage beneath his apartment building, struck him on the back of the head, and taken his keys, his phone, and his uniform jacket. Gerald would later say that the thing that scared him most was not the attack itself. It was how precise it had been. Whoever planned it had known exactly when he left for work, exactly what route he took, and exactly what he wore. This was not random. This had been planned by someone with intimate knowledge of Richard Calloway's daily life. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement was involved. Charlotte Mecklenburg police detectives, along with federal agents who were called and given the scope of what was unfolding, began pulling security footage from the property and from surrounding streets. What they found was deeply disturbing. In the 48 hours before the incident, there had been at least 3 unknown vehicles observed near the estate at unusual hours. One had been parked outside the service entrance for nearly 2 hours after midnight. Footage from a neighbor's camera down the street, captured without anyone's knowledge, showed 2 figures entering through a side gate at 11:40 on the night before. And in one piece of footage that investigators would later describe as the most significant piece of evidence in the entire case, a face was clearly visible outside the guest house on the western edge of the property. It was not a stranger's face. It was someone who had been in and out of that estate for years. Someone with a key. Someone with a reason. Her name was Diane Calloway, Richard's wife of 19 years. But before you decide what kind of story this is, stop. Because the truth of what Diane had been doing and why is not what anyone expected. And the truth, when it finally came out, broke Richard Calloway in a way that no betrayal ever had. Not because of what she had done, but because of what had been done to her. Diane had married Richard when he had almost nothing. She had worked 2 jobs while he built the business. She had raised their children largely alone during the years when Richard was driving overnight routes and sleeping in truck cabs. She had never complained. She had never asked for anything more than what they had together. And then, 12 years into their marriage, a man named Garrett Hollis had walked into her life. Not as a romantic interest, as a threat. Garrett Hollis was one of Richard's senior executive partners. He had been with Calloway Freight for 9 years and was widely respected as one of the sharpest financial minds in the company. What no one knew, including Richard, was that Garrett had been quietly siphoning money from the company for over 3 years. Small amounts at first, carefully disguised in the quarterly reports. Then larger amounts, routed through shell accounts and buried under vendor invoices that did not correspond to any real services. He had taken a total of $4.6 million. And when he realized he was about to be caught during an internal audit, he did something calculated and vicious. He manufactured evidence suggesting that Diane had authorized the transactions. He created a paper trail so convincing, so meticulous, that even a forensic accountant might have taken weeks to disprove it. And then he went to Diane directly. He told her that if she did not help him maintain control of the company during a planned ownership restructuring, and if she did not keep Richard distracted and uninvolved during the transition period, he would send the fabricated evidence to the board, to the SEC, and to Richard personally. Diane would face criminal charges. Her children would watch their mother be arrested. Her family would be destroyed. And Richard, Garrett told her with a smile, would believe every word of it because the documentation was airtight. Diane had been living under that threat for 2 years. 2 years of silence. 2 years of distance that Richard had interpreted as the natural cooling of a long marriage, when in truth it was the weight of a secret so heavy it had nearly broken her. She had not been planning his death. She had not been part of the conspiracy to put an imposter in his car. What she had been doing, desperately and without telling anyone, was trying to find a way out of the trap Garrett had set for her. The offshore accounts that investigators found in her name were accounts Garrett had opened using her information, accounts she had discovered only weeks earlier and had been attempting to document and report through a private attorney. The meeting that Daniel had overheard, the one where someone said he leaves at 8:15, the driver knows the route, everything is already paid for. That meeting had not included Diane's voice. It had included the voice of Garrett Hollis, the voice of a man Richard had trusted since the early days of the company, and a third voice that investigators would spend the next 72 hours working to identify. When Diane was brought in by investigators for questioning, she did not ask for a lawyer. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and told them everything. Every conversation, every threat, every piece of fabricated documentation Garrett had shown her. Every sleepless night. Every moment she had almost told Richard and then pulled back because she was terrified of what it would cost. She had not been distant because she stopped loving him. She had been distant because she was drowning and she did not know how to ask him to save her without pulling him under too. Richard sat outside the interview room for 3 hours while investigators questioned his wife. When she walked out, her eyes were red and her hands were shaking. He stood up. She looked at him and said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you." And Richard, a man who had not cried publicly since his mother's funeral 11 years earlier, had to turn toward the wall for a full minute before he could speak. Meanwhile, the investigation into Garrett Hollis was accelerating in ways that exposed just how deep and how long this had been running. Federal agents executed a search warrant on his home office and recovered a second set of financial records, the real ones, along with encrypted communications on a personal laptop that revealed the full architecture of the scheme. Garrett had not acted alone. He had a partner, a man who had been introduced into the Calloway Freight orbit 3 years earlier under the guise of a legitimate consulting contract. His name was Leonard Price. He had no real consulting background. He was, in plain terms, a professional fixer, someone who arranged things for people with money and without scruples. It was Leonard Price who had located the man placed at the gate that morning. It was Leonard Price who had coordinated the detention of the real Gerald Sutton. And it was Leonard Price whose voice, the third voice Daniel had heard in the kitchen after midnight, matched the recordings investigators pulled from Garrett's communications. The plan, as it was reconstructed by investigators over the following weeks, had been to have Richard's car intercepted on the drive to the office that morning. The man posing as Gerald was instructed to take a different route, one that passed through a section of road under construction, where visibility was low and cell service was spotty. What was supposed to happen on that road was never explicitly stated in any of the recovered communications. But investigators found a reference in one exchange to resolving the ownership question permanently. They found a burner phone registered to Leonard Price that had received a call at 8:07 that morning, 7 minutes before Richard was supposed to walk out his front door. And they found, in a storage unit registered under a false name in Gastonia, a set of equipment and materials that told a story no one in that investigation wanted to believe. Garrett Hollis was arrested at his home in Ballantyne at 11:45 that same morning. He was in the middle of eating breakfast when agents knocked. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. He simply set down his fork, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, and said, "I'd like to speak with my attorney." Leonard Price was arrested 6 hours later at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Miami with a passport in a name that was not his own. He was taken into custody at the gate. He did not say a word. Richard was briefed on both arrests by investigators that afternoon, sitting in a conference room with his legal team and his head of security. When they told him the name Garrett Hollis, he sat very still for a long time. Then he said quietly, "We built this company together." One of the investigators nodded slowly. Richard looked at the table. 23 years, he said, not as an accusation, as a grief. Because that is what this was, not just a crime, but the death of something he had believed in. How would you feel in that moment? If the person who had been beside you at the very beginning, who had shaken your hand when the company was nothing, who had celebrated every milestone with you and called you a friend, turn out to have been planning your death? Take a moment and think about that. Because Richard did not have the luxury of processing it slowly. He had a company in crisis, a wife who needed him, and a 10-year-old boy he owed his life to. 3 days after the arrests, Richard went to see Daniel. He found him in the backyard of his mother Beverly's small house in West Charlotte. A house Richard had not known was in need of a roof repair until Beverly mentioned it quietly during the investigation. Daniel was sitting on the back steps, reading a book about oceanography. He looked up when Richard approached. Richard sat down beside him on the steps, which was not the kind of thing a billionaire typically does, but Richard had never been very interested in performing wealth when something genuine was available. He said, "I need to tell you something." Daniel closed his book. "You saved my life," Richard said, not in a figure of speech way. "You actually literally saved my life. And I want you to know that I understand what that means, and I'm not going to let it just be a thing that happened and then got forgotten." Daniel looked at him with those serious eyes and said, "I just noticed that the ring was gone." Richard almost laughed. "Yeah," he said, "but most people wouldn't have. Most people would have walked right past it." Daniel shrugged slightly, the way kids do when they're uncomfortable with praise they do not know how to receive. His mother, Beverly, was standing in the doorway behind them, and she put one hand over her mouth and turned away for a moment so neither of them would see her cry. What Richard did next was not what most people assumed he would do. In the weeks following the arrests, several media outlets picked up the story, a sanitized version, without many of the specific details, but enough for people to understand that a billionaire had been saved from a serious threat by the young son of a housekeeper. There were suggestions, including from some of Richard's own advisors, that he should give the family money. A large sum, a one-time payment, something clean and transactional that would close the chapter and let everyone move on. Richard listened to those suggestions. Then he ignored all of them. Instead, he spent 3 months working quietly with a team of attorneys and education nonprofit specialists to establish what he called the Carter Scholarship Foundation, named after Beverly's family, a fund endowed with $2 million, designed to provide full educational support to children from low-income households in Mecklenburg County and surrounding areas. Not just tuition, transportation, mentorship, school supplies, summer programs, the full weight of what a child needs to actually succeed, not just to technically attend. He also, with Beverly's permission, arranged for the roof repair, a new car, and a college savings account in Daniel's name. But he did those things privately, without cameras, without announcement. Because the lesson Daniel had given him, whether he knew it or not, was that the most important things are often done quietly, and that the people who deserve the most recognition are frequently the last ones standing in the spotlight. The legal proceedings against Garrett Hollis and Leonard Price moved through the federal system over the following year. Garrett was ultimately convicted on charges including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and, following testimony that clarified the events of September 14th, conspiracy in connection with the events that threatened Richard's life. He received a sentence of 14 years. Leonard Price, who cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge, received 6 years. Both were ordered to pay restitution. For Richard, the day the verdict came in was not triumphant. He sat in the courtroom and watched the man he had known for 23 years be escorted out by federal marshals, and he felt something he had not expected. Not satisfaction, not relief, but an exhausted kind of sadness. The kind you feel when something you love turns out to have been something else entirely. He had walked into that building with Garrett Hollis 23 years ago and believed, with the particular confidence of a man who had earned everything he had, that he was a good judge of character. It turns out even the best judges of character can be wrong. That realization did not break Richard Calloway, but it changed him. He became more deliberate, more careful about access to his daily life, more attentive to the people who had always been near him, but whom he had never truly seen. Diane and Richard spent many months in a kind of careful reconstruction. The distance between them, which Richard had never fully understood until the truth came out, began to close slowly as the real story replaced the silence that had lived between them for 2 years. They attended counseling together, which neither of them had ever done and which both of them found unexpectedly valuable. Diane, for her part, channeled the experience into something lasting. She had always been interested in advocacy work, particularly around economic empowerment for women, but had never pursued it seriously while managing a household and raising children in the shadow of a husband with a very large public life. After September the 14th, something shifted. She began volunteering with a legal aid organization in Charlotte that provided support to individuals facing coercive financial threats. People in situations not unlike the one she had been in, people who were being manipulated by those with more power and more resources and nowhere to turn. Within 2 years, she was on the board of the organization. Within 3, she had helped secure funding for statewide expansion. She never talked about her own experience publicly. She did not need to. The work spoke for itself. Gerald Sutton, the real driver, returned to work for Richard 6 weeks after the incident. He had been offered a significant settlement, both as acknowledgement of what he had endured and as compensation for the trauma, and had the option to retire comfortably. He chose to come back. He said, sitting across from Richard in his office, "I've been driving for this company for 4 years, and I've never had a problem. I'm not going to let one terrible night define what this job means to me." Richard shook his hand and did not argue. Gerald wore his silver ring, the one with the compass on it, every single day, the same as always. And every morning when Richard climbed into the back seat of the Lincoln, he looked at that ring for just a second, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. Because it was that ring's absence that a 10-year-old boy had noticed in the early morning light of a Tuesday in September, and that noticing had made all the difference. Now here is the thing about Daniel Carter that the story does not fully capture in the facts alone. He was not a child with any particular advantage. He lived in a modest house. He attended a public school with limited resources. He had no connections, no money, no audience. What he had was something that no amount of wealth can buy and no amount of poverty can take away: the habit of paying attention, of noticing, of trusting what he saw even when the adults around him might have dismissed it. And that habit, that one simple, ordinary, profound habit, saved a man's life. Think about that for a moment and ask yourself, when was the last time you truly paid attention? Not the kind of attention that comes from staring at a screen or half listening to someone while you check your phone. The kind of attention that comes from being present in a room, present in a moment, present in a relationship, so that when something is wrong, you feel it before you can explain it. Because that is the kind of attention Daniel Carter had. Not because he was special in a mythological sense, but because he was curious about the world and honest enough to act on what he saw. The Carter Scholarship Foundation held its first formal ceremony 14 months after September the 14th. It was a small event, held not at a hotel ballroom or a corporate conference center, but in the gymnasium of the middle school that Daniel had recently started attending. 63 families were represented. 41 children received their first scholarship letters. Beverly Carter sat in the front row in a pale blue dress she had bought specifically for the occasion. Daniel sat beside her in a shirt that was slightly too big for him, the kind of detail that somehow made the whole scene more true. Richard stood at the podium and said many of the things one is supposed to say at an event like this. He talked about opportunity and community and the importance of investing in the next generation. But then he stopped reading from his notes, folded the paper, and looked directly at Daniel in the front row. He said, "I also want to say something that isn't in the prepared remarks. There's a boy sitting in this room right now who reminded me that courage does not always announce itself. It does not always come in a big moment. Sometimes it comes in a whisper. Sometimes it comes in the form of a 10-year-old boy who noticed what a grown man missed and who had the guts to say something about it. I owe him a debt that I can never fully repay, but I intend to spend a long time trying." The gymnasium was quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone did. Ask yourself this, and be honest. If you had been in Daniel's position that morning, would you have said something? Or would you have talked yourself out of it? Would you have told yourself that it was probably nothing, that you were probably wrong, that adults would not listen, that it was not your business? Most of us, if we were truthful, would have hesitated. Most of us would have found a reason to stay quiet. Not because we are bad people, but because speaking up is uncomfortable. Because interrupting a powerful person's routine feels presumptuous. Because the fear of being wrong is often stronger than the instinct to act. Daniel did not let that fear win. And because of that, a man came home to his family. A wife got the chance to heal. A real driver was found in time. A conspiracy was exposed. And 63 families got a letter in the mail that told them their children's futures had just gotten a little bit bigger. This story is true in the ways that matter, in the patterns it reflects, in the choices it documents, in the kind of human behavior it reveals. The betrayal of a trusted colleague. The quiet suffering of a woman trapped in someone else's scheme. The extraordinary attentiveness of a child that the world had not yet taught to look away. These things happen. They are happening right now in cities and towns and households across this country, in forms both dramatic and invisible. Someone is trusting the wrong person. Someone is staying silent about something they saw. Someone is about to make a decision based on a detail they almost did not notice. And somewhere, maybe a child is pressing their face to a window and paying attention in a way that will change everything. The question is whether the adults around them will listen. Richard Calloway, to his permanent credit, did. And that changed the rest of his life. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your own life who once said something small that turned out to mean everything, leave that story in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you're watching this and you're the kind of person who pays attention, who notices the details others walk past, who speaks up even when it is uncomfortable, then you're the kind of person this world needs more of. Never let anyone convince you that what you notice does not matter. It might matter more than you will ever know. Hit the like button if this story stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and we will see you in the next one.